I have had a lot of conversations with investors about this where they've been like, what about Synopsys and Cadence? Jensen keeps talking to them and they're like, but we don't understand what they do. So a lot of people just don't touch it, right? Because
Yeah.
of that. So
Yeah.
fine. Hello, everyone. This is another episode of The Circuit. I am Ben Bajarin.
大家好, I'm Jay Goldberg.
Yes. All right. So Jay's in Taiwan as we record this on Monday for everyone, and we're recording it also on Monday because I have been road tripping through the Pacific Northwest into northern Montana this week. So we are recording slightly late for you all, but we will cover the news, all of the news of the week.
Slightly late and slightly janky audio and Wi-Fi quality.
Yes. Yes, we're not at the point where we travel with professional, Shure microphones and DSLRs for our productions, but so be it. Regardless, last week had some good earnings. Let's start. Yes,
Before we start, I have a reading recommendation for you.
the book.
Sort of.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
it's book length. I I I think you should read. I think everybody should read Magnificus Humanitata. I'm pronouncing that wrong, which is Pope Leo XIV's encyclical on AI.
I heard about this. Yes,
And like let's just say I think you can all assume that I don't usually go around suggesting people read uh
the
Catholic
Pope.
doctrinal documents, but I have to admit this was like super interesting. And I know in some of the press reports kind of reported as anti-AI. It's not. It's very balanced. And I actually thought it was pretty uplifting. Like that was the thing. It was kind of encouraging. Like lots of good things we can do with AI. Let's just make sure we use it right. That's kind of the point. Anyways, interesting read. Um, it's 40,000 words.
Wow.
So book like I read it with my eyeballs. I didn't actually just throw it into AI, but no shame on anyone else if they do just throw it in AI because it is pretty long. But it was interesting.
Okay. Okay. Well, very good. Very good. Let's do a book report. We'll read it and then we'll talk about it. Fans, you can chime in. Our manifesto club, the Pope and AI. Uh, Excellent, excellent. Okay. All right. Let's start off with Marvell. Let's talk more trends in custom XPUs, which we had this conversation not too long ago about how the market is sort of very heavily diversifying, and now you hear obviously more names coming into the equation with the validation of MediaTek with TPU 8T. Obviously, we know that Marvell has been there. We've talked about them primarily being a beneficiary from the peripheral side, so networking, which again we're coming back to our themes of networking, which are never going to go away, since we can always say the bottleneck can keep moving from the chip to the outskirts, interconnect layers and whatnot. But let's talk through Marvell. What was the take? What was the top level take of the quarter? And then let's get into some of the nuances.
Top level take. The quarter was good, a little bit above guidance, in line with expectations. The guidance was same thing, a little bit higher.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
Nothing too exciting, but I think it was good enough, and some combination of that and whatever they said on the call really encouraged people, and so the stock has been up. In the week after, Street seems to have liked their results. Um, I will say, like I was at a dinner last night. I'm in Taipei for Computex, and like that was like the almost the like dominating subject. Like all anybody talked about was like who's doing TPU 8, who's doing Trainium 4, or whatever the next version is. Like that was like it was just like an endless debate. And for in whatever way, Marvell seems to have settled it. Like the street seems to have gotten comfortable that whatever the big next accelerators are, Marvell share is better than what people thought it would be. Right? And that's
Yeah.
very much where the stock trades for a long time has been like, are they in Trainium? Are they out of Trainium? Do they lose half of it? Do they lose some of it? I think they've sort of, to some degree, moved a little bit past that. I think there's still people concerns there, but like finally on the call, we were sort of talking about they were talking about a lot of things, and some of the questions started to move beyond that sort of narrow focus.
So what a lot of stuff I read, and obviously this kind of came up. I listened to the call on one of our drives. Again, going back to my point that we've never discounted them from kind of peripheral of attach. That was, I think, maybe a 2 or 3 quarter theme that they popped up. Trying to get people to not just focus on the XPU design, but the periphery around that, largely around networking optical. So I guess the question is their upside the same if, again, their large focus is on, let's just call them networking collabs slash networking XPUs around optical CPO, meaning that if our original assumption was they're, they're going to benefit from XPU designs from Trainium, which they still will, but largely for more of the ecosystem, it's the networking side. Like, is that a good spot to be? Yes, they have many places to win. Doesn't just have to be the chip, even though that's probably the most expensive, maybe not necessarily the better margins, arguably. But if that's their role, that it's the interconnect, it's the outer band, right, of the XPU where they've got, because that feels like where the narrative gets pushed to, but at the same time, do you know what I mean? Like that's not an always going to be the complete design. Because I do feel like, again, this comes back to, sure, they have many parts to win. You could get share, not even if you didn't win the XPU, fine. But like, how bad is that? Is that an okay place to land? I guess because that's where I feel like they're moving to.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we go back a little bit, I think to some degree the company kind of dug themselves a hole here by being by focusing everyone's attention on their XPU, their custom silicon business, and that made a lot of people on the street nervous about the extent to which is that business recurring, where you have to win it every year, and that's not a good place for a stock to be, especially a company as large as Marvell. I think now the conversation is shifting much more towards, are they doing well because they're doing lots of things beyond just the XPU, especially optical? That's a big part of the story here. They have an interesting optical story. Or is the story they're still very dependent on XPU business, but that XPU business is larger and more complicated and involves more parts. It's a system level design almost, rather than just a chip design. And
Yeah, but I think go ahead, finish your thought.
no, that was it. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
I guess my question is, so if the narrative shifts as it is from the way we thought about XPUs in the training era to the inference era, where these clusters are different, right? You're just going to have more variables. It's not going to just be one compute rack. It could be a compute rack and a CPU rack and an accelerator, or accelerator rack and a memory rack and a storage rack and whatever else, right? We create. Um, we know, and this has been the thematic narrative of pretty much everybody, that they're trying to say, like, the networking is really the central part of this fabric, and there's truth to that. So my point is if and I've been sort of calling them inference cells, because inference cells probably need to be larger, more diverse as a cluster than a training cell was, if we just use this idea of a cell topology wise. So in that vein, then, my guess is there's a lot of more complicated components into that, and so therefore there's a wider range of beneficiaries, is what I'm getting to. So if inference cells do have to become more, are more complicated from a design standpoint, then my point is, if you're thinking through your custom program, I guess there's a lot of mix and matching, I think, goes on, because it's, again, not one vendor kind of solves everybody's problem, is my point. So yes, maybe it's 2 or 3 vendors that do this, but does that complexity mean that we can move out the beneficiary list from the way we thought about training XPUs, where, again, it was just more about the compute tiles, some networking for a big training chip, inference means, again, these opportunities pop themselves up for them to keep gaining share in, again, other parts of the market than just core XPUs. Because again, I think what I'm saying is everything you hear, what MediaTek's coming into this, we don't know what Qualcomm's doing, but it's rumored, right? They're doing an ASIC for a couple of companies. Um, I just don't think Marvell's story can hinge on them being the largest player in just XPU compute tiles. I think it's got to be other things, which is what the point I'm making.
So yes, interesting. I I think I don't know that the inference stack is necessarily more complicated technically. I think it's much more heterogeneous. And so
Yes, heterogeneous.
it's much more complicated to explain and to sort of analyze. And yeah, I definitely it's pretty clear it's going to be a much larger set of people can take advantage of the opportunity, participate in it. Um, although, but does that help or hurt Marvell? I don't think it's entirely clear. I mean, they trying to think if they've done a custom CPU, they
I
could.
don't know I
I
don't.
can't.
Yes, they could,
Yeah,
and
they
they
could.
may have. They may have for
Yeah,
Amazon prior, but I'm not sure that's the program that they're participating in the most.
yeah. So they definitely have the content for that. So in theory, they can participate across all the sort of relevant domains because they have you know all the SerDes and for XPUs, all the IP for XPUs. They have CPU content. They have lots of networking elements. Um, so it could turn out well for them, but they're still like in that sort of camp of doing custom, but just more complex, more broad solution, right? And
Yeah, but
if you really want to be super optimistic about it, you could say that like they probably have better CPU processing capability than Broadcom does, right? Which is one of the only areas where they can say that if they're going head to head with custom with Broadcom, they probably have they would love it if this were a processor CPU fight. I don't think it is, but it's to their advantage.
yeah, yes. Although I would counter this point with those who are doing CPU design. So at this point, really your biggest two, right, Amazon and Google, are using the pure backside companies like GUC, for example,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
they have ARM license, makes it very easy, right, for them to design. They're not changing a lot. Although theoretically, Marvell does have a ARM architectural license should anybody want to move away from a derivative, but Broadcom does as well. So, um, but anyway, my point is like the note I had was, again, we had thought about this through the lens of do you live or die by the compute tile, right, or the compute XPU, and it just feels like the narrative for Mile is more to the throughput layer of inference cells of AI factories, and again, my point was like that's great, but does that keep them as a you know second or third tier beneficiary from this boom versus others that we've talked about was what I was going back for in my brain.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair.
Because
Um,
despite like the stock move, it didn't seem like anybody was like, they're going to be a massive share gainer in this big TAM. It's just they're just still going to be a participator in the networking throughput fabric part of that stack. And again, good, bad, or indifferent. That's just it looks like the way it's heading.
I think, yeah. I mean, a minute ago I said like they took questions about other subjects than their share in XPU. Still,
Yeah.
50% of the questions were about their share in XPU. I actually, if you want to be really cynical, what's actually been helping them most is they are seen as having a good optical portfolio, and people, the market is
Correct.
obviously crazy for optical, and so I think they're to some extent, people are just looking past concerns, qualms they might have about the nature of custom and saying, oh, but they have a good optical story here, right? And they really changed it with that acquisition of Celestial, because that
Yeah,
may give
that's
them
right.
a good leg up when scale up starts and CPO starts to displace some of their legacy business.
Yeah,
And it may just
I
be as simple
agree.
as that. It may just be as simple
Uh,
as that.
I agree. Anyway, I wanted to talk through all of that just so we can set, I guess, the lens in which I think we'll continue to look at and highlight the next few quarters is, does this continue, right? Does this continue to be a throughput story, a networking story in the peripherals to these much more complicated, larger XPU designs that's going on, and versus just focusing on, did you win the Tranium? Did you win the Maya? Like, that's fine. But
Yeah.
my point is, there's other parts to the story to track for their growth. So that was where I was going with that.
I agree with that. Ultimately, their best path forward is to have other things to talk about besides XPU and custom accelerators, and
Agreed.
and their best path forward on that is networking.
Yep. Agreed.
Mm.
And everybody obviously in networking and whatnot land likes to talk about how great. Actually, in the host of our last 3 years of conversations where we joked that we were becoming a networking semiconductor show, this does get even more interesting in the inference era, which we are a part of. So yes, for all of that we talked about it in training, prepare for more inference era networking and fabric and components and transceivers and PMIX.
Yeah,
All right,
yeah.
let's jump to Synopsis. Um,
Synopsis.
yeah. All
Same,
right,
same,
go.
same exact print, same basic pattern for their print as Marvell. Uh, Good quarter, not great, good. Uh, Good, not great guide. Stock is down 10% on the week. So the market didn't like Synopsis's numbers, and I it I admit I'm confused about why. Um, I have some theories, right? I have some
Well,
theories.
I want to hear them.
I um I think um I think the sort of underlying concern. I think there's two concerns. One is there's still a lot of people who think of the EDA companies, the design tool companies, Cadence and Synopsys. They think of them as software companies, and I think they actually mentioned this. Cecile actually mentioned this on the call. Was that when SaaS gets hit because of AI fears, Synopsys stock falls, and it's not that kind of software company. It's not a SaaS company. It's something really different. There are barriers to entry here that are massive. So I think one, they're sort of fighting off that fear, but the other sort of longer term question is, to what extent is sort of growth topped out for the EDA companies? They've had a great run
Yeah,
over the last
right.
10 decades. They've doubled their number of customers. All the hyperscalers have come on board, designing their own chips, but then they can't double it again, right? We're not going to see a doubling of EDA customers. Everybody who's going to get an EDA license has one at this point. And so how do they keep growing? I think that's sort of
Yep.
the subtext of what people are worried about for EDA.
Yeah,
And
I mean, in a lot of ways, the way we kind of highlighted and dug into ARM, right? When you just look at IP, this was before ARM was in the camp now of making their own chips, right? It was always like, look, the vast majority of people have a license. You have to create more IP on top that gets licensed. That's essentially right part of their growth strategy. And I do think a lot of the narrative, I guess the sentiment question I have is, a lot of the commentary was built up to increased complexity, chiplets, bigger chips, like all of those things adding to the areas where both Synopsys and obviously Cadence, right, but folks in EDA could start to push into content, right? As you move to lower nodes, as you moved to more complicated design processes, that was a net benefit. But I feel like a lot of that got loosely priced in, I guess. Like, We assumed that. We saw it was happening. We know the Angstrom era is coming. I don't know if all of that has played out. I mean, again, I do think Synopsys has still a lot of IP to leverage for the custom XPU camp that we just talked about that's not there yet. And as well, I think they have a lot more memory IP than people give them credit for that's coming
Hmm.
around HBM. But I don't know how, again, there's no way to track that, right, to a point of I'm growing because more people are licensing memory from me, right, or my memory controllers or whatnot. So um but my point, my
I think that
again,
go ahead.
go ahead. No, finish, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think that actually touches on what probably their biggest problem is that very few people actually understand what
That's
makes their
absolutely
business
right.
tick. Right? It's just it's complex, and I don't even, I'm not gonna pretend that I understand it fully. They could probably do a better job of explaining it, both them and Cadence. Uh, it's a little it's not so it's not that it's that mysterious, but I think people have a hard time getting their heads around like what are the levers, what are the mechanics of how they price things and how things move. It's not clear. It's pretty opaque to most people.
But again, that's the nature. I'm with you. That's the nature of a licensing business. What they
Yeah,
have is the second order effect of that. It's a supremely technical licensing business. So there's a lot of people who are, and as a matter of fact, I have had a lot of conversations with investors about this where they've been like, what about Synopsis and Cadence? Jensen keeps talking to them and they're like, but we don't understand what they do. So a lot of people just don't touch it, right? Because
yeah,
of that. So
yeah,
fine, but again, I think the execution, proof pudding, quarters over quarter, can they continue to benefit from the broader systems uh, uh, complexity shift to more complicated chips? Obviously, optics, glass substrates. I imagine at some point into like just the complexity of these chips, bigger, reticle growth, like those things. I think it can help, but again, you're absolutely right. Even if all those things help, it's very hard to draw a clean line to what cycle are you really benefiting from, right? In terms of dollar growth that's coming.
yeah,
So
yeah. It was interesting on the call. Synopsis like repeatedly sort of made the case that I, uh, I think if you boil it all down, what they're basically saying is they're going to be able to raise prices because of all those things you just mentioned. Means you need more complex tools, and they are able to monetize that in some way. Um, but it was very hard to understand. It's going to be it's going to be impossible for people to appreciate that because nobody knows how to build a model, right?
mm,
What are the drivers for the model, right? Is it wafer starts? Is it complexity of design? How do we measure that? How do we quantify all of that? And I think I think there's probably a way to do it, but it's gonna take them explaining it better. But there's definitely they definitely are trying to get that message across that there's new things coming out that they can raise prices, they can charge more for new things. Right? They talk a lot about AI, using AI tools, and then today Cadence, it's Monday. Cadence is up because NVIDIA has this new AI
yeah,
agent that does verification. Like I suspect Synopsys has something similar. How do you price those things? Is it a big enough bump to be meaningful? What does adoption look like? How, what's the time frame for customers starting to pick those things up? I don't think that's all clear.
yeah. Well, they are having an investor day end of September. I
That's
imagine
right.
it will be very lots to talk about as they shape that narrative. We'll see
Yeah.
how they do it.
And Synopsys also has one other sort of problem unique to it, which is they just acquired Ansys.
Yeah,
And
right.
the street, I've talked about this before, the street hates that deal. Um, partly just because they paid a lot of money for it. It was just a big number. Um, and it's a struggle because Ansys and like like Ansys and semiconductor revenue was like only like 5 or 10% of its business, right? And if you look into it, like the reasons that Synopsys wanted to own Ansys are pretty compelling because of all the things you just mentioned. Like Ansys does sort of physical modeling of the physical world, right? And if you're trying to build these very complex chips on very complex materials, you need to have a really good understanding of how the physics of it work, because otherwise the chips will melt, right? And
Mm,
other reasons too, but right. So really, like it's really compelling for that 10% of revenue. But then what about the other 90% of Ansys's business? And they took a lot of sort of questions on this subject. Nobody quite came at it directly, but there is this concern. Like anytime one company buys another, you always have to worry about how the integration goes.
sure.
Factor in on top of that that they now have an activist investor on the board of Synopsys, just joined this quarter, and so like the presumption is that the activist is going to want them to cut costs. And so there's a real risk that they cut the wrong things inside of Ansys. They don't fully understand how it works yet. And so is that other 90%, which you paid a lot of money for, is that at risk? And I think that's still to be seen. They went out of their way to say that they've integrated it well, but I think it's going to take some time to prove that. And if you're not a semiconductor customer of Ansys, how do you feel about you
Sure.
know being owned by Synopsys, a company you've never heard of? You're not in the semiconductor business. You have no reason to be doing business with Synopsys. So
Yeah.
it's all to be determined.
Agreed. I mean, but at the same time, right, the opportunity they've tried to keep, pushing is that's a huge part of their broader silicon to systems engineering platform, right? Just to hold the framing line. So, but you're right. It needs to be explained better as to how they capture more upside in what I articulated, which is move to more complicated designs, bigger chips, different variations of substrate tiling, whatever, and how you benefit from that holism. Like that's the time is now if they're going to continue to educate the market in how systems complexity benefits them. But again, licensing businesses, as we know, are genuinely hard to cover for most people. So
Yep.
there you have that. All right, let's jump to Dell. We talked a little bit about them because I was at Dell Tech World standing in the racks in which got pushed to CoreWeave, the NVL racks. So yeah, let's jump off with Dell.
So I just want to give you credit. You called this. Like we kind of mentioned on the show, but I remember at the time we talked about it, and I was thinking, oh, we should talk about this more. But you were very upbeat about Dell on Twitter and in private. They reported a very good quarter and just a monster guide. I mean, just like
Yep. Yep.
it's an AI era guide, and their stock is up a ton since
Yep.
then. Um, good numbers all around. Yeah, yeah, yeah. They're up. What is it? 50% on the week.
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to be clear, there's a reason. So there's only a handful of OEMs who should even be in this conversation of selling to, let's call it, the larger neo clouds. And again, what I articulated is an on-prem movement that I believe will happen. I just don't know the degree of that will happen. I'm attempting to size this market, which is if the largest enterprises in the world decide to move some infrastructure on-prem. Again, I'm not, I don't fully believe that it is 100% on-prem solves all your problems, but obviously, as we talked about, you don't want to, you can't keep paying market rates for tokens forever until some sort of a business model emerges. All of the signs point to kind of this broader trend of client on-prem and some broader cloud usage target. So I do think there's weight there. But Dell, again, if you just look at their history, in fact, and I tweeted this too in what's happening right now with Dell in NVIDIA is very similar to what happened with Dell and Intel in the Pentium age, where what Dell just did is they made very good boxes. They were like deep partnership with Intel. It was just them and Intel. Whatever we need to do, let's collaborate. Let's move this forward. And it's sort of like your purest expression of the integration of those two companies with, again, manufacturing and costs and all of the things, the efficiencies that Dell brings to the table in their supply chain. So that same thing is happening now. The way that they're basically like, oh, HPE, you bought, Juniper. Juniper gets in the way of companies that just want to use NVLink, right? For example, whereas Dell is just like, we've got the best in class networking. NVIDIA. We're working with them across the stack on all of their whole portfolio, purest expression of integration with NVIDIA. And that is going to benefit them a lot across all of these vectors. And so that's why I think they are the best position. I think we talked about this, the issues that were happening with Smith Micro, that they would be one of the best beneficiaries from that. And that's becoming true. But I believe they're the OEM of choice for, sorry, Supermicro.
Supermicro.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Um, they are the OEM of choice for all the neo clouds, first of all, and they bring a lot to that table in systems integration. Uh, the other thing I will say is, like, again, I think told you, like, I was on the floor, right, of Dell Tech World. Like, you continually hear people just rave about their customer support when they buy Dell racks and servers. Like, Dell support is S tier class. And I, in an era where that's a factor, like, you want to buy these things, you want to know they're supported, that somebody solves your problem, that your network's not going to be down, that if something breaks, they send text. Like, that is, to me, a big deal. And so I think that sweeping reputation, and again, just the tight coupling and bundling with NVIDIA, to me, puts them right in that parallel of the benefit they had in the PC era with their relationship with Dell. I mean, Intel, that's now NVIDIA in this AI factory cycle.
That's a pretty good thesis. That's a pretty good thesis. I mean, I think at this moment, this quarter in particular, what helped drive them was one, Supermicro, like we were talking about,
Yeah,
probably lost a lot of share when the Feds raided them.
100%.
That's that's a problem. But there's no way that, like, that was all of it. I mean, Dell's B here was pretty big, so it wasn't just gaining from Supermicro. I think Dell early on made some very smart bets in terms of using their balance sheet to win some of these deals. They've been willing to finance things, which we've talked about before, and it's always a risk. And this is not like complicated circular financing. This is just very typical industrial company providing good terms, payment terms, and financing for its customers, um, which is a risk long term, but not at the moment. Um, and it's paid off really well for them. I mean, they've been doing this for a couple of years now, and it's clearly paying off for them. Um, and I think also just these AI systems are getting so complex, and
Yep.
the timescales are so tight that
Yep.
having you know Dell really seems to have its A game on right now.
Yeah, and again, I think the neoclouds need the additional support that they give them.
Yeah,
There is a software layer of their business that they are helping with these neoclouds with, despite the neoclouds fundamentally wanting to admit that. There is a layer that they're using that ties all this together in systems management, hardware management. Like, again, I mean, I think people forget that obviously there's a lot of Dell, laptops in the enterprise, but there's a lot of Dell server
hmm
products in enterprises, and they had built that trust up and become kind of the provided player of that kind of prior cycle where there was a lot of servers on prem. And that's again why I think those, enterprises were like, look, we trust you, you bring this service, so we're having those conversations. And then again, like we talked about, like, I just telling you, man, their storage business is better positioned than everybody's. Like, the way they, like, if
yeah,
you, again, Nick, you listen to, like, the commentary, right, from AI factories, how much you're going to need storage, how much you're, like we talked about, moving data from cold to warm. I mean, it really is kind of that full stack solution. But again, I just think them being like, look, we're just going to tie ourselves to NVIDIA. They called out their networking business the same way that Jensen likes to call out their networking business. That networking is a pull forward strength. Again, because they're just bundling this with NVIDIA. They're not getting in anybody's way. And right now, those neoclouds, and I believe those who bring on-prem, that's what they're going to want. Like, they're not going to want complicated XPUs and fragmented systems and pick your networking provider. Like, they want one neck to choke. That has been the world scenario of how you buy IT hardware. Dell's very good in that world where you want one neck to choke because you rarely have to choke it. I've literally never used that phrase before in my life, but that's what just because again because of their support, they're so good about it that you never get like it's not you don't get mad, you don't have to. All right, anyway, I'm not gonna exhaust that analogy, but
Got it. Got it.
yeah. So so regardless, yes, Dell's well positioned. I expect this to maintain. Uh, Going forward because their backlog, as I imagine, will continue to grow, is what it sounds like. So,
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too in a broader sense. If you think about the neo clouds and possibly to your point, possibly enterprise too, um, need support in the ways that like we've sort of stopped thinking about OEMs like Dell and HP a lot because the hyperscalers were driving so much of the category and they really want to do it all themselves and they're capable of doing it all themselves. But that's only, 5, 10 companies that are capable of that. Um, and there's still some sort of tier two hyperscalers who use a lot of Dell systems or whatever OEM, but Dell mostly.
yep, yep,
Um,
yeah,
it,
it, yes,
and I think it's more than just Dell. It's something I've seen in a few other categories where companies that were selling into the server space were kind of worried about their future a few years ago, and now they're feeling better about it. But I've done this work for clients is like looking at how much support they need, which customers do they go after, you know, can they bet their future on neo clouds? Right. They've spent a lot of time banging their heads against trying to get into the hyperscalers with mixed results. But now the neo clouds are here. How much, there's a lot of them. They need a lot of support. And Dell is well positioned to benefit from that.
yep, agreed. And like I was saying, like I, we know the what we'll just call cloud, uh, TAM is big, but loosely in my earliest of preliminary attempts to do this, I'm increasingly convinced that the on-prem, let's just call them on-prem mini AI factories, again a phrase I've never used before until now, um, could genuinely add another triple digits of billion to the infrastructure TAM by the end of the decade.
Big number.
Big number. All right, so as we close this out, I'm going to land you on one of my new theories. Okay, bench
Okay.
thesis time. So you got what I just said. All right. In the smartphone era, and if you just listened to, I don't know, a host of narratives from Apple from, the past 4 or 5 years, so just sort of riffing on what we talked about last year, like in the ways in which NVIDIA is like Apple, there was always a stat I really liked from Apple around the App Store. And Tim Cook would use this exact phrase. The App Store is an economic miracle. And he would point to the trillions of dollars of um, value creation for developers. So unrelated to Apple's direct revenues, right? What they were creating in value for the ecosystem. I think you can start to make a very similar point about NVIDIA, that those who are in their ecosystem, tied to their ecosystem, unrelated to how much money NVIDIA is going to keep making. You like Dell, you ship NVIDIA products, or others who do that, others who build software and part of this, developers who build on top of their token generations are creating massive amounts of value. Again, I don't know if that's $1 trillion of economic benefit, but whatnot. I'm actually trying to build that model. But you see what I'm saying? Like, if Apple was the heart of this and the App Store was that economic miracle for software developers, there's something similar, I think, going with NVIDIA in terms of ecosystem value of creation for those who standardize and build on the platform.
I liked your thesis last week that the Android, iOS, NVIDIA analogy. I think this one is a little more contentious. Um, One, I have to think about it. This is the first I'm hearing it, so I have to think through this because I'm not sure the platform effects are the
Is quite the
working
same.
quite.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think also if I went out and asked people at the floor in Computex tomorrow, which I'm going to do, I think they would be I mean, I guess similar to Apple, there'd be a lot of questions about to the extent to which NVIDIA is extracting all the value from the platform.
I think that's right too, but again, right? I think Apple would have had the same argument. It's like, well, you're selling the hardware, and so your margins are ridiculous. But I think the point that I'm interested to tease this out in is, in a moment like we're in, and again, we've talked about this, right? That there's suns, and we think that NVIDIA is a gravitational pull. That's absolutely right. Um, there's a standardization that happens around, like, something is the nucleus of that, and in that standardization the value creation of that kind of boom happens, right? Again, right? We talked about these sons, right? So it was IBM, then it was Intel, then it was Apple, now it was Google to a degree in the internet, but now it's NVIDIA, right? And so I think there's just, yes, they're absolutely going to continue to extract that value. But my point is that this becomes a very strong upward growth story if this is true, what I'm saying, that those who just participate in the ecosystem also make a lot of money, to use the developer point, is sort of where I'm landing.
Um,
And Dell is a good example of this, just making a lot of money, going full bore in the NVIDIA ecosystem.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure because I think that, especially because I'm here in Taiwan, I know that when I talk to the ODMs, the Taiwanese ODMs, they're a little nervous because they're making a lot of money because the volumes are so
Yeah,
big.
right.
But NVIDIA is also to some degree robbing them of some of their means of differentiation,
Sure.
which is, the volumes are big, but the margins are getting a little thinner. So the absolute dollars are rolling in right now, but like their own defensibility is a concern.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Um, yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
let's
noodle
revisit
on it.
this next
Noodle on
week.
it. Noodle on it.
Let's revisit it next week
But
because I have some things like that sort of came out in NVIDIA's keynote today that I want to follow up on.
yes, we will talk about that next week, everybody, and we will give, because I've already seen on the Twitter sphere a lot of very bad takes about the PC industry for people who
Oh
knew
man.
nothing about the PC industry until apparently the last 3 months. So we will give you the quintessential deep dive on the PC industry in this next episode. But I don't want to draw this parallel exactly the same way, but there are not that many differences, again, to this moment of compute infrastructure, to AI factories, to the early days of the PC. There was a good run there, and then exactly what you said is right. It creates differentiation problems. It creates the sea of sameness. Now, again, that's a consumer point more than it is an enterprise buyer. But I'm just, you and I were both in the midst of this in the 2000s to that. Like, there's a lot of similarities to that moment around AI factories and the compute at the center standard, which is NVIDIA at that time. In the PC industry, it was Intel Pentium. So anyway, if I'm just using epochs, right, that we're modeling, there's similarities there in that. But yeah, noodle on the other point of, because there's a software layer of this that's kind of similar to, call it Windows software development, that was value creation in the PC era as well, that I think has some parallels. But I can't tie a number to that, but I think there's shades of similarity.
I I'll have a different. I have a different analogy. I'll share next week. I'll tease
Okay,
it a little bit.
noodle on that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well,
Cool.
everybody, thanks for listening. Sorry it was a little bit late, and look forward to the next episode where we'll talk all things Computex. Have a great week.
Thanks everybody. Thanks for listening.